Sveiki sugrįžę po, tikiuosi, palaiduojančio Velykų savaitgalio ir sveikinu įsijungus iš naujo Lietuvą Ameriką. Šiandien apie tai, kas turėtų būti savaime suprantama. Rusija yra blogio imperija, žudo, nori sunaikinti mūsų civilizaciją, bet kažkodėl vis dar tenka aiškinti tai sadiškiams, vakarams, kartais net patiems savo. Su Paula Dobriansky, buvusia valstybės sekretoriaus pavaduotoja, kalbame apie tai, kaip dar Reigano laikais mūsų sąjungininkai turėjo įrodinėti, kodėl su imperija reikia kovoti. Ką šiandien daro Rusija ir ką vakaruose kai kurie labai patogiai pamiršo. Jos tėvas, Lev Dobriansky, buvo vienas pirmųjų, kuris garsiai pasakė, pavergtos tautos nebus laisvos, kol egzistuos ši blogio imperija. Šiandien tas pats blogis vis dar čia. Tik mes kažkodėl tapę atsargesni, išblyškę, tylūs. Tad apie tai ir daugiau netrukus. Gero klausimo.
We are recording, so Vincentas is my, friend of, young generation of American Lithuanians whose grandfather repatriated from America back to Lithuania, and his whole family is helping us, including with this podcast. So, Paula, I read yesterday, finished reading that book of your father's, and I was impressed, really. And maybe you could say a few words for young generation of Lithuanians. Who are you? Because I know you, I would say, like my own godmother, I still remember the first meeting with you and late Albright, first meeting in my embassy, and you said, Žygis, let's fight for democracy to be reinstalled in Obama's administration agenda. And we did it. But of course, you worked for Reagan. You were his director for European and Soviet affairs. You've been Undersecretary of Global Affairs, and your father is a legend who created the whole captive nation movement. So briefly, if you could say a few words.
Well, first, Vigas, may I just say I'm really geez, you know what? Let me, because I know he's recording. Let me say, can't believe Žygis. I said it with a V.
Yeah,
I can't believe it.
Some people, still remember Vigo de Sušackas, and they make that thing.
Yes, I apologize. Yes, I don't know why I said that. So Žygis, excuse me. I am really honored to be on your podcast, and the fact that you are focusing on my father's book, Unyielding Resolve, Captive Nations and the Path to Freedom. So about me, just in background, I've had 30 plus years in the U.S. government. And specifically, I will pick the highlights. I worked for 7 years in the Reagan administration. I was on the Reagan's National Security Council staff. And it was an important time. As we know, President Reagan delivered a speech calling then the Soviet Union an evil empire. And also relevant to my father's book, he's featured in the book because he cared deeply about the concept of captive nations. But about me, I was in the Reagan administration on the National Security Council staff, dealing with then Central Eastern Europe and also then the Soviet Union. I also was in the Human Rights Bureau as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, dealing with all issues global, not just one region. And then I later became an Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs. That was in the George W. Bush administration. I also had 2 other hats. I also dealt actually with the Dalai Lama, and China in that regard. And I also was the president's envoy to Northern Ireland. I'll end on this. Right now, I am vice chair of the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. I teach at Georgetown University, and I also lecture at Harvard. I'm a senior fellow with the Belfer Center at Harvard. So let me stop there. Oh, and maybe most importantly, 2 boards I am on that I think really relate to today's conversation. I am on the board of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. And you mentioned Vincentas, his generation. That memorial foundation was created in order for those to remember the evils of communism, what it did, how it destroyed and tried to destroy so many nations, but how all these nations were resolute in terms of their history, their culture, their freedom, religion, everything, and defied communism and sprung to be free. And certainly Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia really underscore that, because I remember when I was in the Human Rights Bureau, we worked very hard to deal with the issue of, remember, we would never acknowledge, the forced incorporation of the 3 nations into the Soviet Union. And we spoke to this issue time and again. So my background has been very geared towards that.
Thank you, Paula. It was, the shortest introduction to, decades of freedom fight you've been doing together with your father. And I would really recommend every current freedom fighter to read that great book. Because, okay, this is my first question. In this book, your father is mentioning in a lot of pages that, even little kind of path forward can open, can change decades. And one moment, it was actually new for me, that your father and a lot of many other freedom fighters, they were trying to convince different US administrations after Second World War that this is not about containment of evil empire. This is about liberation of those freedom fighters, 10,000s of guerrilla warriors in Lithuania and Ukraine, but containment policy won. So can we say today that if Americans would be listening to your father like in 50s, 60s, the Cold War might look absolutely different. Maybe Russians would not build the Berlin Wall. We would suffer, in not such an immense historic features. So what would you say about that?
Well, you go to the heart of the book and the book's thesis. And let me say at least a basic comment before I address the point you made. My father wrote this book because he was first the author of Captive Nations. He wrote the legislation, PL 8690, that actually called upon every president since Dwight D. Eisenhower to the present time to actually focus on this concept, to indicate that it had to be part of one's own policy and undergird one's own policy. Every president did issue a proclamation from Eisenhower to the very present and called upon countries globally and also those in the United States, our own states and legislators, to recognize the captive nations and how they exist. But you go, and so his book is intended to give a firsthand account of that concept, of what it has meant, the kind of battle that he waged on understanding what is that strain in Russian history and statecraft. And that strain was not containment. The dominant strain was imperialism. It's a dominant imperialism strain in Russian history and statecraft. And he argued that that was the most compelling driver of Russian domestic repression and also external aggression. And you hit it exactly. And so let me make one other comment, if I can, because it relates to what you just said. He did definitely swim against the tide of those policymakers at the time. And, his concept was rejected by many. but he did swim against the tide, and he rejected the most common explanations of sources of Russian conduct. The term was also used during when the Soviet Union existed, Soviet conduct. He basically developed a unique kind of explanation, which is the captive nation's conduct. He argued that for centuries, it's not just about communism, but for centuries that Russia expanded by taking over adjacent lands in both Europe and Asia and incorporating them into Moscow's imperial framework. That was the thesis. So you asked the question, yes, I could argue that if one had followed that path, yes, we could see a very different terrain, a very different, landscape, geopolitical landscape. Definitely in Europe, Asia, globally, in terms of what we ourselves, the United States, had been espousing at that time. And if I may mention one other thing, I want to highlight, if I can, in the book, the foreword was written by David Rivkin. David Rivkin emigrated from Russia, by the way. He became a teacher's assistant for my father. He also became, in the United States, a renowned constitutional scholar, writing prolifically for the Wall Street Journal. His pieces are read by many. I wanted to say this because he wrote the foreword and he wrote the epilogue. And he mentioned, by the way, in the epilogue in particular, I wanted to cite this. He said, Dobriansky's most important academic and public policy achievement was his thesis that the key enduring theme of Russian history, religion, and political culture was its overarching imperial drive, the perennial desire to absorb neighboring countries and build the largest land empire in the world. He understood, and in his own words, he put that. And I wanted just to say that as a tribute to David. David tragically passed away in the end of December. And that's why thank you for letting me cite that and cite him and what he had to say, because he not only understood, he left then the Soviet Union, but he made his way in the United States, and not just made his way. He was not only an articulate and deep and profound scholar in the sense of his writings on Russia, and particularly defense issues, but he became a constitutional scholar, and he understands and knows what it means that countries are sovereign, they have their own rule of law, and that this kind of behavior is unacceptable. It was unacceptable before in history, and it certainly is unacceptable in what we witness now.
Well, if I may, Mrs. Dobriansky, first of all, it is truly an honor to be speaking with you. I can't put it into words nice enough to truly thank you for giving us the time. But my question is this. I mean, let's bring it closer to the present time, right? First of all, we are very grateful for what great, I have to put it this way, statesmen like yourself, like Reagan, have done for us, like your father as well, to stand up for the values of democracy that America is supposed to espouse, the values of freedom, and that we have for now, and in great part thanks to your work, to the work of your father, to the work of Ronald Reagan. But it seems that every generation that fights these fights of freedom and liberation, every generation seems to forget, at least on your side of the pond, what evil Russia truly is. You put it very well yourself just now, that this sense of imperialism, this want to dominate, to occupy, to destroy, and to kill, is really part of the DNA of the Russian Empire then, the Soviet Union later, and now the new Russian Empire. Let's call it what it is. And first of all, my question essentially is, why do Americans seem to keep forgetting that this is what Russia is, and how do we fix that?
Well, I will first say education and the content of education is very important. And you may know there are many debates that ensue in the United States in terms of what's taught at the high school level, what's taught in our colleges and universities. And I will say that there are those universities which are steeped in this history. In fact, because we are also on this podcast featuring my father's book and celebrating it, if I may say, be so bold to say it that way. It was Hoover Press that reached out to me for his archival work. They wanted to have, and Hoover, by the way, Vincentas, if you may know, or maybe your listeners may know or not know, Hoover is connected to Stanford University in California. They have an institute, Hoover Institute, which focuses on trends over decades, history relevant to Russia, relevant to then the Soviet Union, relevant to all and each of the Baltic states, to Europe, looking at what happened in the world wars, looking at the present geopolitics. Well, they reached out to me and they asked me, please, could we have your father's archival material? To me, that's crucial. Why? Because it does provide a reservoir of material that students and younger people of your generation have access to. They have access to it. Same at the Reagan Library, by the way. There as well, there's a reservoir of material. So I look at it two ways. First, education does matter, what's being taught, number one. And I can't say that in all of our universities in the United States that actually we do have that kind of breadth and scope and deepness. But at the same time, there are these archival materials. You have a podcast. I think you can reach out to like-minded. By the way, I did a series in Poland. They reached out to me. It was a private university, and they wanted to focus on these very concepts. And by the way, that private university really wanted to focus on these key issues. And I was very proud to be able to do that. This was before my father's book was published. But let me mention one last thing. I mentioned the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. It's not just about the museum. It's not just about the story that's presented at the museum. That foundation has a vigorous educational program for the very reason you just asked me, because the belief was that there were gaps in education. And if you don't mind my saying, not just in the United States, I'm going to say that throughout Europe. I think that Europe does and is very steeped in the issue of the world wars and beyond that, its own independent histories. And I think there's a stronger understanding. But with regard to this topic today, about why did this happen and what Zigis just asked me about why was there this debate of Russian conduct? Well, there was the theory of containment. And by the way, in my own father's book, he, and even in David's forward, containment had its place, but so did this concept of the imperialistic strain of Russian conduct. And that could have impacted certainly the way in which our policies were crafted.
Paula, just maybe really to summarize to current and future generations on the job still not done, what your father is, as I understood, reading this book, tried to pass to next generations that Russia is really eternally building its empire. Many people in this red area died, millions died, and they're still dying. And each kind of appeasement towards Russia, that actually each president after Reagan showed this trying to reset relations. We met with you when Obama was trying to do it, but your father is writing so great about Chicken Kiev speech of President Bush. I still remember Clinton meeting with Yeltsin in Vancouver, and just like your father is writing, just few weeks after that meeting, Yeltsin invaded Chechnya, killed so many people. So each kind of appeasement brings blood. And now really focusing on current days, Paula, we hear statements from America that, well, America should recognize Crimean occupation. Ukrainians should get rid of their NATO membership. And we should engage into economic relations with Russia. For me, it's like empowering empire. It's like legitimizing their occupations. It's like 100% against the cause of Reagan. And when I see Reagan, picture behind President Trump, for me, it's like, who is more American? Who is more actually fighting for American interests than those Ukrainians or Lithuanians trying to remind that, please do not appease empire. Empire kills, empire occupies, empire goes against American interests. And America was created by people who, fled from empires. You created, the best nation on the world because you hate empires. So how can we match current politics with
Rodriguez, let me jump right in. And I hope you won't mind my sharing the thoughts of a few others, not just me, because I think I've already stated very clearly what my father's thesis was and why it's germane. It was germane in the past. It's very germane today because we witnessed certainly the invasion starting and even before, but 2014, I'll pick that recent period of the invasion of Ukraine. So yes, all of your words, you've underscored why this thesis, this concept, it was relevant then, it's relevant now. But may I, if I may, I hope you won't mind, I liked in the book, you cite my father's words. One of the best accolades that could be given are those that know it firsthand and speak to the issue, not just only my father and not just me. So forgive me, I'm going to mention 3 people if I can, and they are as part of the book. First is your neighbor in Estonia. Thomas Ilves knew my father. He became, as you know, the president of Estonia. He was one of the people who wrote a blurb for the book, a comment. And I want to say this, if you don't mind my saying this. It says it succinctly. He wrote, today as Russia, with its heinous and brutal war, tries again to make Ukraine, Georgia, and others its captive, Dobriansky's analysis and his concept of the captive nations of Russia is striking in its predictive value for understanding Russia and the threats to peace and to the West today. It says it very succinctly. Katya Yushchenko, she was Kathy Shumachenko when she was working with my father. I met her in the United States because she was a student of my father at Georgetown University, and she began to work with my father. If I may, she herself also wrote here, by the way, she says, Dobriansky understood that the USSR was a prison of nations, struggling to break free, and did everything he could for decades to help bring independence to those nations. His views were vindicated when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and now, when Putin has brutally invaded Ukraine and proved Russia's intent to reestablish its repressive colonial empire. What some considered his unconventional thinking has become accepted wisdom today. I am honored that Dr. Dobriansky was my professor, mentor, boss, and friend, and am deeply grateful for his indefatigable, I can't get that word out, efforts to define and fight Russian imperialism and colonialism. I wanted to, because Vincentas is here, there is a young Uyghur who is working at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. I cited, you have your neighborhood, I cited Ilves because Estonia. Estonia, there was an article recently, and it's not just only Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, all are very concerned about what next, what we see next, depending on how this plays out with Ukraine and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's concerning. Secondly, you, of course, I've cited Katya and about Ukraine. Very concerned what will happen with Ukraine. But thirdly, let me mention Uyghur. This is about China. And I did want to say this. She writes, as a Uyghur woman witnessing the ongoing persecution of my people in China, Lev Dobriansky's unyielding resolve resonates deeply with me. This book serves as a powerful reminder that the struggle against oppressive regimes is far from over. When she says that, Dobriansky's insights into the forces of legitimate nationalism and the unyielding human spirit provide timeless lessons for those of us fighting for freedom today. This book is not just a recounting of history, it's a call to action for all who stand against tyranny. I hope you will forgive me for reading those, but I felt it was better said than I could have said. And why I said it is because it shows there are those who are desirous of acting. And this is a call for action. Your podcast is a call for action in this regard. And I'm grateful for it. I'm grateful because it's not just about my father's book, the concept, but it's clear that there are those who are watching what is happening in your neighborhood and very concerned about its ramifications, and not just in your neighborhood, in Europe, but also globally in the Indo-Pacific, and specifically with regard to China, Taiwan, and others as well.
If I may, Mrs. Dobriansky, something that very well said, and but what does puzzle me, if I may use that word, is that there have been calls to action, as you say, for decades. Even before your father, even before the Soviet Union came into existence, there were always voices saying that this Russian Empire is nothing but evil, right? And even with these voices, that empire of evil remains. The prison of nations remains, and that prison of nations continues to kill people to this day, and it continues to be appeased. And I can't explain it in any other way, except for the fact that that beacon of freedom, America, just continues to not do its job. Yeah, sure, we had one time in the 20th century, or not one time, but one term in the 20th century under Reagan, where things were looking up, where it seemed that beacon of hope and freedom and light, America, was doing its job, fighting for us, for those captive nations. But we haven't seen that since.
I will answer your question. You're going to ask why. And you essentially asked me that a bit before, and I mentioned education because you linked it. But there's another thing. Policy against countering disinformation and misinformation. There are many who read. It's a battle. It's a very fierce battle. And there are tools and instruments technologically. By the way, when you look at issues relevant to radios, podcasts, television, by the way, it's striking to me how those communist countries and those imperialist and tyrannical countries, they invest heavily in radios, TV, social media. Let me give you an example in a very different part of the world. I testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee with Madeleine Albright a number of years ago. And very briefly, one of the things I mentioned? Chile and Colombia. This isn't in your sphere here. Chile, the Chileans cited that there was Russian interference in their social media that provoked a massive protest that, by the way, undermined the incumbent government. And the Colombians were on the record as well. So it's not just about education. It's about an effective battling of disinformation, misinformation, the use of radios, television, social media. Yes, there is a battle of ideas. There is, as this book attests to it. My father was battling ideas, and Zigas began this discussion this way. So my answer to you is, do you just throw up your hands and say, well, we haven't succeeded yet? We have succeeded. Many of the countries that were under the yoke, by the way, of then the Soviet Union are free. The fact that we are having this discussion, to me, underscores and attests that freedom, what it means to you and the values, and you have to preserve that. So I will counter you. There have been strides made, but we must persevere. There are, as we've witnessed, regression.
Paula, if I know that those are the last minutes that we still have with you, and I very much agree with you, but I would say it's not only education, it's not only fighting disinformation, but it's also political courage. Paula, we have to...
Yes, this political courage and leadership.
Exactly.
President Reagan, my father cites in the book, if I can just say this,
Yeah.
do you know that he was the only U.S. president who actually held a massive captive nations ceremony signing in the White House? He wanted to call attention to it. Political courage and leadership does matter. You are quite right.
And we have to, push those ideas back to the Hill. I will come back to the Hill like more or less every month. I will bring the best Europeans who still believe in those American dreams and values. And we have to find new heroes. Paula, I will invite you to one of the roundtables with organization that once your father led, Ukrainian Congress of America, maybe in June. I will try to do an event, The Rise of Evil Empires, and what will our response be? I will try to ask those congressmen and cheers and friends of freedom with whom we are fighting every day, where are you, guys? Those ideas and those fights are not finished. Americans shouldn't empower empires. They should destroy them. They should make people free. And you did it, Paula. We are happy. We are, we're shining. We are strong as never before because of that freedom. But it is not defended in still so many nations in the East. So,
really, may I say this just in conclusion? Please, may I? First, thank you for this. Thank you for all that you do. And Vincentas, I'm glad to hear your comments as future generation. But thank you. You have been a warrior, a champion of freedom, Zigas, and I admire you greatly. And I am proud that you have been my friend for a long, long time, for decades. And you always have had the courage to speak out. I wish my father were alive today to be your friend, to know you, but I'm grateful for your words. And I'll conclude on this note. I do want you to know that his concept and his the actual legislation, PL 8690, always received bipartisan support. And as I said, every president from Eisenhower to the president has issued a proclamation every third week of July. So there is a foundation there. There is a foundation there from which to build on. And I want to just thank you for your political courage. I admire you greatly.
Thank you, Paula. We'll meet each other on the Hill fighting for your father's ideas, who are our ideas as well. Thank you, Paula, for everything you did for us. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Vincentas, for picking up the spear. We're counting on you, okay?
Thank you very much. We'll try. Na kągi, manau, Paula Dobriansky labai aiškiai pasakė. Jei norime išlikti, turime šviesti. Ne kartą per metus, o kasdien. Mokyklose, universitetuose, gatvėse, per radiją, per podcastus, nuosekliai. Ne apie tai, kas patogu, o apie tai, kas pavojinga. Nes kas nesupranta, tas greitai tampa taikiniu. Mes nebegalim savo leisti abejoti tuo, ką žinome. Rusija tai blogio imperija. Ir jei ją ignoruosim, niekas mūsų neapgins. nei istorija, nei geografinė padėtis, nei šūkiai apie laisvę. Tad dėkui, kad klausėt. Palikit komentarą, ar susidurėt su tuo pačiu naivumu aplink save ir pasidalinkit šiuo pokalbiu su tais, kurie dar svarsto, ar verta provokuoti. Švieskimės patys ir švieskim kitus, kol dar turime šviesą. Iki sekančio.